There are no perfect families, but are there families with secrets? Secrets that many times are so perverse and dark that they decide to keep them locked up under key, just as Blanche Monnier lived locked up for 25 years. Who tried to hide her for the rest of her life? As always, between heaven and earth there is nothing hidden, and the truth always comes to light. Today we'll tell you the criminal and horrifying story of this woman, her kidnapping, and her liberation. Blanche Monnier, better known as the Recluse of Poitiers, was born in France in 1849 in the bosom of a wealthy family that belonged to the great socialite of Poitiers in France. Owner of an attractive beauty, which made her one of the most sought-after women of her time. But despite her huge list of suitors, she set her sights, according to her mother, on the wrong man. A love that would condemn her to live a life of total confinement. For Blanche fell madly in love with a lawyer much older than she was, one who did not come from a wealthy family like hers. So the class prejudices of those times denied her the opportunity to be happy with the man she loved. But behind all of this, there are other reasons that prevented Blanche from being happy. And that is that this lawyer with whom Blanche had fallen in love was a Protestant lawyer, and the son of a Republican, and the Monniers were Catholics and monarchists. This made them incompatible families, and added to this, Blanche's father hated the Republicans because he had lost his position as Dean of Letters at the University of Poitiers in 1877, the year in which there was a serious political crisis between Republicans and Royalists. Therefore, the Monniers could not allow their daughter to marry one of their enemies. Although the young girl was determined to marry that man, no matter what her family and the rest of society said. But her parents, and especially her mother, were not going to allow her to stain the good name of the family. Her mother described her lover as a poor failure, one who had nowhere to drop dead. So to prevent Blanche from escaping and marrying someone they didn't approve of, they locked her up without compassion in an empty and small room in their house, where Blanche did not come out for 25 years. Meanwhile, her closest relatives pretended and mourned the sudden disappearance of the young girl, as if they didn't know the girl's whereabouts, and they invented any story saying that she was in a boarding school in the UK. As the years went by, the pretext changed, and they said she had moved to Scotland. To justify in one way or another her absence, they went on with their lives normally, leaving Blanche in oblivion. But they were not the only ones who lied about the whereabouts of this charismatic and attractive young woman, because servants and domestic workers also knew. But by orders of their employers, they were forced not to say a single word about Blanche's whereabouts. If they did, they were threatened to be fired. Meanwhile, Blanche went mad and vanished within the four walls of that room, which became her cruelest prison. The most important thing for the family was reputation, since her father Charles Emile had been, as we said, Dean of the Faculty of Letters of Poitiers. Her brother had been the sub-prefect of the city, and her mother was a distinguished lady dedicated to social and charitable work. And though they tried to hide Blanche's whereabouts, they did not succeed for long, since their neighbors and those who visited the family heard screams of a young lady inside the house. In response, they said, quote, "We have already found our beloved and dear Blanche, but unfortunately she has gone mad and assumes that she is a prisoner." This excuse allowed them to justify the desperate screams of a young girl who wished to leave the tormenting confinement. But her family did not want to allow her to leave that room ever again, so they sealed all the windows so that her screams could not be heard, and so as to have an explanation of them, and to whomever asked for Blanche, they simply answered that she had died as a result of her own madness. And though she hadn't really died, she was effectively buried in that room, where she began to deteriorate little by little like a corpse. She never bathed or cleaned herself, and lived surrounded by her own body waste, vomit, bugs, and remains of food, the little that they gave her. And many times they forgot to feed her. But if Blanche had been considered dead and had remained so for a quarter of a century, How did they discover her whereabouts and the fact that she was still alive? Well, in 1901, the police station received an anonymous letter from one of the Monnier's employees, who denounced what the apparently distinguished family was doing with Blanche. The letter read as follows: Mr. Attorney General, I have the honor to inform you of an exceptionally serious occurrence. I refer to an unmarried woman who is locked up in Madame Monnier's house, half-starved, and who has lived for the past 25 years in a putrid bed. In a word, in her own filth. With these words, the prosecutor and none of the authorities could believe what was said there, since the Monnier family enjoyed an excellent reputation. But the accusation was so serious that the chief commissioner of Poitiers sent 3 of his agents to visit the house that same March 23rd, the same day they received the letter. They proceeded to the Monnier's house, located at number 21 Rue de la Visitation, to check if the complaint was true. Once they arrived at the house, at first sight the rooms looked clean, as if the anonymous message was a lie. But the agents did not leave without checking every corner of the house, and when they went up to the second floor, everything began to change. There was an unpleasant smell coming from within the house, which the policemen began to perceive as they climbed the stairs. And a somewhat distressed Mrs. Monnier insisted on going down, since there was nothing to see there and that the servants had not done the cleaning. But the tension grew when the agents asked her to open a door they found locked under key, and clearly was the place where the bad smell was coming from. The woman refused many times to do it and invented excuses such as she didn't know where the keys were. But this time, her lies and excuses did not work as they had in the past. So in view of her refusal to collaborate with the authorities, they proceeded to break the padlock, and after doing so found the most disgusting horror. The smell was so putrid that the men could not contain their nausea and desire to vomit. They waited a while to get used to the smell and then proceeded to check the room, where they found an old woman, deeply emaciated, naked, and barely covered with a filthy blanket. What they saw was a woman who looked more like a mummy than a person, and they set out to open the windows to help the smell dissipate. Blanche was sleeping on a filthy mattress surrounded by excrement, cockroaches, and vermin. Her Canberra was very long and tangled, since she had not cut her hair or combed it for years. In fact, they say it weighed 2.5 kilos. Her nails were also surprisingly long, so long that her hands looked more like claws than hands, and her body was so thin that it was evident that the woman seemed to suffer from extreme malnutrition. Once the windows were opened, Blanche was dazzled, as if she hadn't seen sunlight for years. And she desperately began to scream, screaming and imploring the agents not to take her out of her little cave, as she called her torture cell. But once they managed to calm her down, she told them that she'd been kept chained for a long time, and that she had barely been given any food. It was not for nothing that she weighed just 25 kilos, and was so weak that the police had to help her get up and walk, since she could not stand on her own. They took her to a hospital for emergency treatment, but before doing so, they took a photograph of her to record the inhumane way in which they had found her living. And according to one of the agents, during the transfer to the hospital, Blanche mentioned that it was wonderful to smell the fresh air. The insalubrious conditions in which she had lived for years left her doctors with the question, how could she survive so much hunger? How could she have survived the bacteria, not getting any sun, and not even socializing a little? A question that remains to this day. 40 days later, Blanche's photo appeared in all the newspapers in France and became a worldwide news story. A story that left many of the inhabitants of Poitiers stunned. A real cold water bath, because days before the scandal, the prestigious Louis de Monnier had received an award from the Good Deeds Committee of Poitiers for her contributions to the city. And so far she had only shown impeccable behavior. But after the scandal broke, it became clear that she was not the Good Samaritan she pretended to be. And the story does not end here. because for the crime her relatives had to answer to justice. A media scandal was unleashed in which Louise, Blanche's mother, was not able to justify the horror, and she denied that her daughter had been held against her will. She claimed that Blanche was not in her right mind, that she refused to eat, that she did not want to be washed, and that no matter how hard they tried to get her out of that filthy room, they were not able to succeed. Then she changed her version of the story, saying it was all the fault of the servants who did not take care of her as they should have. After issuing this statement, Mrs. Monnier returned to the house on Rue de la Visitation, where a crowd was waiting for her and peppered her with numerous questions day after day at the door of her house. The scandal began to affect her health, since her good image had been lost, and now she was seen as a monster. Due to such social pressure, she died of a heart attack 15 days after her best-kept secret came to light. She thus died unaccountable to the law. But somehow someone had to answer for this act of cruelty, and it was Blanche's older brother Marcel Monnier, another respected member of the bourgeois community of Poitiers. He lived with his wife in the house next door, and he was aware of everything that had happened with his sister, and was an accomplice from the first moment that her parents locked her up. He was the man of the family since the death of his father, and he did not lift a finger to free his sister. He preferred to leave her locked up amongst her own excrement and without much to eat. And that is why in October 1901, 5 months after the rescue of his sister, he was brought to trial to face responsibility. In a trial that undoubtedly shocked France, Marcel pleaded not guilty, arguing, according to his version of the facts, that he had tried to put Blanche in an asylum but had met with the refusal of his mother, since it would call into question his honor. He also added that his sister could have left that room whenever she wanted, since she was not obliged to be locked up. But prosecutors pointed out that the door and windows of the room were closed with chains and padlocks, to which he alleged that after a while the decision was taken not to let her out, since Blanche suffered from a long list of mental problems that had worsened over time, ranging from hysteria to anorexia, and from this to coprophilia through exhibitionism. But the brothers' arguments were not enough to excuse the inhumane way in which she had been living, and the judge decided to sentence him to 15 months in prison for being an accomplice. Once he served his sentence, he left his hometown to avoid criticism and rejection, moving to a mansion in the Pyrenees, where he died in 1913. But he was not the only one to appear before the authorities. Also appearing were the servants of the Monnier family, since they were also seen as accomplices for having told nothing of what was happening. Each one declared that they'd been threatened not only with being fired, but also with being killed if they opened their mouths. Others said that they didn't know the real situation of what was happening, since they were forbidden to go up to the second floor of the house. And if they did so, under no circumstances could they open the door of the room where the prisoner was being held, since apparently the only one who could do so was one of the oldest servants in the house, but she had died some time ago. After the trial, no one knew who had sent the anonymous letter, though it could have been Marcel himself, or one of the servants, or someone linked to them. But according to the press of the time, it was believed to be a new servant that the Monniers had hired. But this is only hypothesis, because the truth is, no one knows how that anonymous letter arrived at the police station. So what eventually happened with the inmate of Poitiers? Blanche was transferred to the hospital to try and restore her health, but her life was never the same. Her confinement and the dreadful situation in which she had lived for years left her with an endless number of mental illnesses which prevented her from rejoining society, and she remained confined to a psychiatric hospital until she died in 1913, the same year in which her brother had died. In short, this has been a dark story that not only awakened the social horror, but the interest of many investigators who set out to investigate the real reason why Blanche was locked up. If for love, as the prisoner said, or for mental illness, as her family stated. The reality was more complex than it seems, because if she was really locked up so that she would not marry, she would have been released when her suitor died. Or perhaps the confinement had driven her mad, so they preferred to leave her in captivity. We'll never know. But Jean-Marie Augustin, professor emeritus at the Poitiers Law School and author of The True Story of the Kidnapped Woman of Poitiers, assures us that Blanche was schizophrenic, anorexic, and an exhibitionist. Quote, she liked to show herself naked at the window and would go out into the garden with her camisole torn to leave her sex exposed, in full view of everyone, with her buttocks in the air, writes Augustin, maintaining at the same time that the disease progressively worsened and that Blanche was not always in the terrible condition in which she was initially found. Since her decline accelerated from 1886, when the maid who took care of her and the only one who knew how to control and dominate her, a skill that the younger maids lacked, died. A version also held by neurologist Gerard Samat, author of another piece of research on Blanche Monnier, in which he corroborates that Blanche suffered from mental illness that worsened over the years. Quote, she probably suffered from schizophrenia, a disease that at the time was called dementia praecox, and for that reason she was locked up at home to avoid a scandal. Because having a madman or a mentally ill person in the family was a source of shame. Meanwhile, for others, beyond the scientific opinion, they consider the confinement to be an act of utter cruelty. Because no matter what was the real reason to keep Blanche locked up, the conditions in which she was living were the real crime. A situation which did not deserve forgiveness, since no one, no matter how demented they are, deserves to live like an abandoned animal. It's clear that there are perverse families who are willing to bury alive any member of their clan in order to maintain a false image of perfection before society. What are your thoughts about this horrible situation? Let us know your opinion in the comment section. And if you want to enjoy criminal and shocking stories, be sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of the criminal cases we have in store for you. That does it for today. See you next time.